Welcome to the latest installment of the Vandenberg Coalition series, Countering Chinese Communist Party Influence Around the World. Despite the fact that a majority of Americans view China as the United States' greatest strategic adversary, what to do about the rise of the CCP's influence across the globe remains a point of significant debate among experts, policymakers, and politicians. To date, much of the focus has centered on how to best handle the threat, specifically whether we should redirect our resources toward the Indo-Pacific in an attempt to contain the CCP, or whether doing so will create significant gaps that China will then exploit, further jeopardizing our interests. This series dives into these questions with leading experts in 8 different regions, ranging from outer space and the economy to Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and South Asia. In each installment, we will speak about China's growing influence in the region, how it measures against American influence, how to define our relationship with the region in light of competing priorities, and what America can and should be doing to better protect and advance our national interests. In today's episode, we will speak about the newest frontier of U.S. China competition, outer space. As the United States and China compete over economics, technology, and geopolitics here on Earth, space is the natural extension. To lead us in this discussion, we're proud to have Carrie Bingen, former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Director of the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Dean Cheng, Senior Advisor to the China Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace and Non-Resident Fellow at the George Washington University Space Policy Institute. Dean and Carrie, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So for most people, I think the concept of space seems really far away from reality. We only access it through Hollywood movies. Why should everyday Americans be concerned with the politics of space? And why should they be concerned specifically about the proliferation of Chinese space programs? And maybe Carrie, we'll start with you.
I think that it's a good place to start with how space affects us in our everyday lives. Why is it important to the average American? It fuels our economy. You think about GPS use in our mobile phones and deliveries. Anytime we go to the ATM machine or you go to the gas station, you are relying on space capabilities to enable to make that transaction. Our ability to communicate across the globe, understand the weather and the environment. We use space every day and we maybe don't realize it. Space also just gives us an advantage. It gives us an advantage on the diplomatic front. Seeing the buildup of Russian forces before they crossed into invaded Ukraine. On the national security front, intelligence, our military relies on space as the ultimate high ground. It underpins all of our military operations. It allows us to use precision weapons so that you don't have to use as much, but also to prevent friendlies on the ground from being struck. It fuels our technology sector. It attracts scientific and technical talent into our industrial base. China wants those same benefits, both the economic, the national security benefits, as well as the technology advantage.
That was very comprehensive. Dean, anything that you would add to that?
I think it's fascinating that 65 years after the start of the space age, the extent to which, on the one hand, as Carrie noted, space is actually part of our daily lives. If you want to know where your Amazon package is, that's partly based upon GPS, partly based upon communication satellites. If you want to know whether tomorrow's weather or next week's weather is going to be very good, weather satellites are an essential part of that. But space is, in a sense, in the background. It enables our lives, but it isn't obvious. And so you're right. People often think, well, what does space have to do with me other than my morning tang? And the answer is actually a whole lot of your day-to-day activities are definitely influenced and impacted by space.
So historically, lagging behind the United States and Russia in the global space race, China has made really rapid advancements in recent years that pose a threat to American supremacy in space. So the head of the Chinese lunar exploration program even likened the contest for space to disputed islands in the South China Sea. What methods is Beijing developing to expand China's presence in space?
So I think that when we look at the Chinese space program, we need to recognize the key term here is comprehensive. We see the Chinese pushing across the board, whether it's in space launch, satellite manufacturing, in terms of satellite manufacturing, every type of satellite, reconnaissance satellites, weather satellites, communication satellites, big satellites in terms of ones that are multi-mission capable, like large communication satellites, but they're also a major player in small sats. They are basically, at this point, probably actually on level with the United States in terms of interplanetary exploration. Consider that until about 2021, every image from Mars was American. All those wonderful, fascinating Mars rover shots and all that, those were all American. The next set of pictures came from Chinese missions. No other country, not Europe, not Russia, not Japan, has successfully landed on Mars. China was the first country to land on the far side of the moon. Not even we had done that. So in some respects, they are actually our equal, and in a number of aspects, including their growing ability to exploit space for all the various mission areas that Carrie noted, the Chinese are catching up and have actually eclipsed Europe and Russia in many cases.
I think Dean said it right. It's not only is China's program comprehensive, but it is the most expansive space program that we are seeing right now, not just in how it's using space, but also the threats that it is developing to counter others' space capabilities. President Xi has made it very clear in his space dream that he wants China to match and surpass the United States in their space capabilities. They've designated aerospace as one of their top 10 technology areas for prioritization. So you have government will, direction from the top, increased defense spending and prioritization against space, greater state and private investments. And then you also have China targeting our technology and our other Western companies' advanced technologies through both legitimate means, investment, but also stealing the technology. So they also have a full campaign underway to advance their technology and in many cases steal ours.
And how would you describe China's reason for that goal? So you said that their goal is that they want to supplant the United States. Why do they want to? I mean, is this generally they want to beat the United States and everything? Is this part of them wanting to create a sort of new world order? Is it them trying to intimidate other countries? Is there a nefarious reason for it, a non-nefarious reason? In your own opinions, what do you think is the impetus behind this for China?
So I'd offer three areas. First is the national security and military advantage. They recognize that if you can dominate in space and you can leverage GPS-like capabilities, they have a system called Beidou. You have intelligence capabilities where you can see forces massing on the ground. You have communications, that gives you an edge on the battlefield here on Earth. So it's an advantage. Economically, they want to see the same benefits that we see economically from communication satellites, from GPS-enabled markets, both national security and commercial, agricultural, you name it. But then there's also a third piece to this, which is they are intent on shaping the world order to their system, their institutions, their values, which are vastly different from ours. So if you can get more countries around the world to adopt their autocratic model, their methods for surveilling and controlling communications, including from space, you are now creating greater alignment to their view of what the world order should look like.
I think also that there's a couple of, from their perspective, very fundamental issues at work. From the CCP's perspective, we are now living in the information age. The currency of international power is not simply how many merchant ships do you produce or how many steel I-beams have you made, but the ability to generate and move information. And space is a key means of doing both of those things, of seeing things, of communicating, of transmitting information. So if you fall behind in space, you are going to have a hard time leading in the information age. The other thing is that the Chinese leadership sees space, and in their terms, it is very dense in high technology. If you think about a satellite, it has advanced materials. It has advanced communications capabilities. It required advanced manufacturing. It required systems integration, systems engineering. Improve your space capabilities, and you have these knock-on effects. You have these additional benefits. And I don't think it's an accident that, for example, a lot of China's aerospace executives wound up being transferred over to COMAC, their commercial airline corporation, because the Chinese also want to compete in other aspects like manufacturing their version of the Boeing 777 and 787. And they see if you have experience in aerospace, you can port that set of capabilities in manufacturing and design over to other industries.
So, Dean, you had mentioned that in certain areas, China is not only achieving what the United States and Europe have achieved in the space realm, but actually surpassing us. So what are the specific areas that China seems to be focusing on in terms of expanding its space programs?
So we see this in a number of areas. We see them, for example, they field a full portfolio of weather satellites, whereas it took us years to finally update a lot of ours. This is in part because they have programmatic stability. When they say we are going to produce a series of satellites by 2027, 2030, they will get those satellites up by 2027 or 2030, and you won't have these constant changes in budget and design. One of the key areas that they have made major advances in is counter space capabilities. We've seen them demonstrate the ability to shoot down satellites. One of those tests generated more debris than any other incident throughout the space age. We have seen them test the ability to kill satellites at geosynchronous orbit, probably the most valuable real estate in space. We're seeing them develop a variety of capabilities, including directed energy, kinetic kill satellites, jammers, etc. Our Congress has chosen, in its infinite wisdom, to limit our ability to test anti-satellite systems, pretty much ignoring the fact that both Russia and China are openly pursuing such capabilities.
Why have they done that? Why have they decided to do that?
It's somewhat complicated, but it comes down to this idea, beloved in political science and arms control theory, that if we don't do things, other people won't. Because, of course, other countries never make decisions on their own. They only do it in response to the United States. The reality, of course, is that China has openly tested ASAT capabilities. So have the Russians, and they've pretty much ignored the fact that we have now even announced that we are not going to even test anti-satellite capabilities, a decision made by this administration. Hailed at Geneva, hailed at university campuses, but I think that if you go to U.S. Space Force, they're actually going to be rather concerned about that kind of denial.
And you hear Space Force leadership talking more about this idea of denying others the use of space, denying them an ability to close their kill chain. So what does that mean? China is making great inroads in developing their own intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR satellite architectures from space. They now have this very high seeing eye on the ground. And when you pair that with the inroads that they're making on compute, on artificial intelligence and processing, they are quickly developing the capability to detect and target our forces, our bases, our allies and partners on the ground using their space capabilities. So when you hear Space Force leadership talk about, we now need to figure out how do we protect our forces on the ground from their ability to use space to target us, you're now starting to see the door open to a robust discussion, a needed robust discussion on how do we deny their use of space. And that ultimately leads down the path of us developing our own counter space weapons and offensive capabilities. But we do that in every other domain. So we need to mature that thinking as well in the space domain.
Is there any concern, you hear this in conventional sort of context, but also I wonder in the space context, as we worry about how China is going to use certain equipment, and AI is a great example of this, we maybe are speeding along very rapidly so that we can beat them, but may not be giving enough consideration to how we're building those systems. So is there any fear of like us being in a situation where we're very worried about what they're doing, and so we're just trying to kind of go as quickly as possible? Do you think that there's sort of a reasoned consideration as we're pursuing our advancements in space?
So when it comes to artificial intelligence in space, I think a couple of things to keep in mind. When the Chinese talk about artificial intelligence, what they are focused on is not Cyberdyne Systems Model 101 Terminators. What they are focused on instead is the use of artificial intelligence to manage the terabytes of data per minute that are going to sweep over the modern battlefield, including in space. How do you manage huge amounts of data like that is constantly being updated? And the idea is that you can only do it at the speed of light, and that means the speed of computing, which is artificial intelligence. In space, this is further exacerbated by the reality that everything in space actually moves very fast. Mm-hmm. And your reaction time is measured in literally seconds or less, microseconds in some cases. So what the Chinese are talking about when it comes to artificial intelligence in space is space traffic management, space situational awareness, being able to track the thousands of objects in space, and then being able to do something about it if necessary, whether it means moving a Chinese satellite or firing an intercept or maybe a directed energy weapon. As the Chinese also push into what's termed cislunar space, the volume of space between Earth and the moon, as the Chinese talk about establishing lunar colonies in the land, that space traffic management issue is also going to require artificial intelligence. Because again, things are going to be moving very fast, your reaction time is going to be very limited, and your ability to keep watch over everything is going to really push the limits of human capacity. So there's both the military and the broader space exploration aspects that AI is going to be affecting.
Yeah, I think the gloves are off in this AI race right now. The last national defense strategy had made the point of, the nation, the forces that are able to command and adapt and integrate with artificial intelligence first is going to have the advantage. And in this business, it really is all about who has that competitive advantage. I think what's different now, which is quite interesting, and former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work used to highlight this, is we are now in an era, this third offset, where in the past, the way that you offset parity or if you were behind was, the first offset was the nuclear evolution. The second one was precision weapons to offset a conventional disadvantage. Now you have technology like artificial intelligence and advanced compute that is helping to offset disadvantage or enable a nation to have advantage. What's interesting this time, however, is that the cutting edge artificial intelligence research and development, it's not government funded and it's not being led by governments. It's being led by the commercial sector. So that puts, I think, an even greater impetus on us and on the government to figure out how do they best leverage and integrate those technologies and work with the commercial sector.
So it's really interesting because in China they have civil military fusion. So the sort of government and military apparatus kind of control what the commercial sector is doing in these spaces. And in the United States, it sounds like the commercial sector is kind of, controlling the development in these things. So which do you see as sort of like the better long-term model here? I mean, on the one hand, China can direct its resources much more effectively, as you mentioned. What is sort of the value of the commercial aspect of this? Is it more advanced innovation?
Well, I think first off, we need to recognize that military-civil fusion or civil-military fusion in China is partly a function of the Chinese view of themselves as still less developed than the West. So every renminbi has to do as much duty, double duty, triple duty as possible. If I'm going to invest renminbi in building railways, those railways need to be able to support both commercial and industrial purposes, but also military purposes. And so what we have seen is when the Chinese build railway stations, they specifically build the loading facilities to handle entire armored battalions so that they can load and offload all at once. That's a lot of weight. So when we look at things like space, which a RAND report from the 1990s said is 95% dual use, when we look at things like artificial intelligence, what the Chinese are saying through civil military fusion is, look, China cannot afford two separate industrial bases. So every advance needs to be able to do both commercial duty, if useful, if necessary, if it's competitive, but also serve military ends and purposes. What that means is a whole lot of industrial policy, which is wonderful if you think your bureaucrats can consistently pick winners over time. If, however, industrial policy setters are influenced by corruption, by political interests, by basically picking wrong, then you miss the boat. And that is the challenge for the West. Is we believe in free enterprise. We believe that a lot of decisions made at lower levels, a la Friedrich Hayek, is going to produce better results. The Chinese, who are still run by the Chinese Communist Party, believe, no, a small handful of people making those decisions at the top will more often wind up right.
And for me, this also is a matter of values and transparency. The military civil fusion policy paired with the Chinese national intelligence law passed back in 2017 compels commercial entities to work with the government to share secrets and to keep it not shared, so to keep it close hold. The United States doesn't have that kind of compellence policy that compels commercial industry to work with the government. We'd like to work with, former government person is, I would like to see the commercial sector work more closely with the government because I think there's a lot of innovation and technology to take advantage of. The government can't compel this. I saw it firsthand when I was at the Pentagon overseeing an artificial intelligence program looking at full motion video called Project Maven. We couldn't compel a large technology company to work with the Department of Defense. It took a lot of discussions. It took greater transparency into how the Department of Defense wanted to use that technology and the curbs that they put in place. So there is a choice and there's transparency that we have in the American system that you just don't have in China.
I want to talk a little bit about the American system, and I want to start with something that you both mentioned. You referenced the Space Force. So help us kind of understand what the Space Force's role in all of this is. I think there's sort of like this image of the Space Force as, sort of like militarizing space, but that's not really what they're there for. So I'd love to kind of hear what their role in this competition looks like and how they're trying to either combat China or advance American interests in space.
So I'd say the Space Force, they are a military service, so their job is ultimately to protect and advance our national interests and our national security in space. So just like any other service, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, they have this responsibility to organize forces, to train our service members, and to equip them with space capabilities. As Dean was talking earlier about the growing threats to space capabilities, that was a big motivation behind the establishment of the Space Force. So protecting and defending against those threats and ensuring that our space capabilities can support forces on the Earth with GPS, with communications, with intelligence, detecting missile launches, having a greater awareness of what's happening in the space environment. But then also, as we talked about earlier, is seeing other adversaries that would use space against us. How do we now deny their use of space? So a broad mission set that ultimately comes down to protecting our national security interests in space.
What types of tools do we have for that last part, the deny others' use of space? What types of things are we talking about in that realm?
Well, the DIA kindly provided a report a couple of years ago about the various capabilities broadly speaking, technologically speaking, not by country, of what you can do to counter space systems. So there's everything from, because ultimately space platforms, satellites and like, are about information, gathering it and moving it. Some of the tools available include jamming, include hacking, whether you're hacking the satellites, whether you're hacking the ground stations, whether you're hacking the software that controls the satellites or the data flowing over it. Then you've got the stuff that captures people's imagination, the Star Wars space weapons. No lightsabers or X-Wings yet, but we are talking about direct descent, kinetic kill vehicles, co-orbital kinetic kill vehicles. We are talking about the potential use of things like lasers, particle beams, etc., high-powered microwaves. And then some interestingly exotic options, like, for example, aerosols. In space as a vacuum, if you fired off a bunch of essentially, say, paint, it would form a cloud that wouldn't necessarily go anywhere. If you put that cloud between the satellite, say a reconnaissance satellite, and Earth, you would essentially block its view until the satellite moved with a cloud of paint that would sort of sit there. So there's some interesting at least theoretical options available that, again, if I remember, it was a DIA report from a few years back that is publicly available.
And at CSIS, we produced a report a few years ago looking at different ways to defend against these threats. So I would offer there is a spectrum of, just like there's a spectrum of threats, there's a spectrum of different ways to defend against threats to our space assets. And it isn't always defense on orbit. There are things that you can do on the ground to protect our ground stations and our networks, our networks here. So it can range from physical, technical ways and architectural. So just having many more satellites rather than a handful of really large, exquisite satellites, diversify your architecture and now put up hundreds to thousands, makes it a lot harder for an adversary to target and take down thousands than it does 6. If you're concerned about cyber, you increase your cybersecurity. If you're concerned about laser dazzling, you can put filters on your satellites. There are also operational techniques and tactics that you can use. If you see an incoming satellite cozying up to you, you can move out of the way. So maneuvering operations. And then there's policy too that we talked a little bit about earlier. So bringing together the international community, sanctions, demarches, and other ways in policy to send a deterrent message responding to bad behavior.
The Department of Defense identified 3 areas as priorities for U.S. outer space operations. So they said space control, space cooperation, and space classification. And I'm wondering, for those of us who are not experts in this space, so to speak, what do each of those 3 things mean, and how do they relate to our broader objectives in space? Maybe start with Dean.
Well, space classification actually is probably the most important because it's a prerequisite. There are, if we get the number probably wrong, but something like 24,000 objects in Earth orbit. Everything from paint flecks to dead satellites to rocket bodies from second stages and the like. Keeping track of them, keeping track of where they are at any moment, where are they heading? Is there going to be a potential collision, which has occurred? Keeping things like the International Space Station, the Chinese space station safe. All of that requires tracking these thousands of objects, knowing what they are, are they live satellites, possibly weapons, or are they, gloves, literally. I think there's literally a handheld camera in orbit that got off of one of our astronauts. After that, space control is sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum. Knowing what's up there is one thing, being able to do something about it, including defending your own systems, maneuvering your satellites so that they don't run into something else in the process. And then space control, cooperation, and yes. So space cooperation is perhaps the hardest in some ways Because while we have the Artemis Accords, et cetera, that are talking about U.S. cooperation with key friends and partners, there is limited at best prospect right now for space cooperation with the People's Republic of China, and our ability or desire to cooperate with Russia in space is even more limited. We are cooperating on the International Space Station, although the Russians every so often threaten to boot us off. But given the war in Ukraine and ongoing tensions between the West and Moscow, there's limited prospect at best of increased cooperation with Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, all the usual suspects in terms of bad actors.
I do think there's a great amount of opportunity cooperating with allies and partners in space. And I think we're really just at the cusp of that. On the military front, we've long done it on the civilian space front, and NASA has been a fantastic ambassador for space cooperation there. But as the Space Force builds up its capacity, I think there'll be greater opportunities, whether with our European allies and NATO, with Japan, Australia, South Korea, Middle East. There's some growing space programs there with the UAE. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there. And I think that's one strategic advantage that the United States has over China. We have allies and partners who want to genuinely work with us. China, I think, has maybe Russia right now, maybe North Korea as well.
Venezuela, actually. They have indicated that they are going to invite Venezuela to participate in the quote-unquote International Lunar Research Station, which also is going to involve the Russians.
Yeah, it sounds promising. What, as we think about, China's rise in this space, like what are the things that we should be really proud of that we've been able to achieve? In what areas in space are we currently still surpassing China?
At the moment, deep space exploration remains dominated by the United States, visiting the outer planets. I believe we outnumber everybody else in terms of visiting places like Saturn, Jupiter, Pluto, although the Chinese are going to be pushing an expedition to the Jovian moons. One hopes that they don't go to Europa. I believe that that's been reserved for somebody else. In terms of building an integrated space architecture, simply because we've been doing it longer than they have. The U.S. Space Force remains the key provider for space domain information in terms of keeping track of those 20,000 plus objects in space. And we provide updates to various other space operators for free. That is still pretty much the gold standard. If we think that there's going to be a collision, we inform all the operators, and other countries, other commercial operators basically depend on the US to do that. China, one doesn't seem to yet have the architecture to maintain such monitoring, but more to the point, they don't seem to believe in altruism. They don't seem to be providing that kind of information to other players, much less doing so for free on a regular, updated basis.
I still believe and would assess that the United States is the #1 space power, and you can see it in terms of satellite capabilities that we launch, what our intelligence community is doing. However, I am concerned with the trend lines that we're seeing out of China and their leadership intent to match and surpass us. But for now, our ISR capabilities, our missile warning capabilities, GPS, I mean, we still have the lead there. You look at our commercial sector, really the revolution that SpaceX and Starlink has brought, not just to the commercial sector, but to the battlefield, like in Ukraine. So we have this phenomenal commercial sector that is allowed to innovate and really push the envelope, largely through private capital investment, not taxpayer dollars. So government needs to take advantage of that. I think we're still the partner of choice globally. NASA has led the way there, but increasingly you see countries around the world want to work with our Department of Defense on space and space security. And then I just want to echo Dean's point about transparency is the way that the U.S. Largely conducts operations is through, they are transparent in their data sharing, transparent when it comes to space exploration and lunar activity. If there is a risk of collision, you have an entire organization that's responsible for providing public information, providing information to operators to try to mitigate the risk of collisions. You don't see the same practice or behavior out of the Chinese side. I mean, there's still, we talked overclassification earlier, so I mean, I think that there are still challenges, and there will remain some I'll say performance attributes that will need to stay classified. But in general, the U.S. is much more transparent about its activities and its budgets and programs than China, frankly, ever will be.
And as you think about the areas where we would need to advance at a much more rapid pace than we currently are, what are the types of technologies that you think the U.S. government should be prioritizing as it relates to space competition with China?
I think I'd largely start with scale and speed. Is the U.S., we've operated in space for a long time thinking it was generally this pristine environment. We could build these large school bus sized satellites and they could basically operate unchallenged or unthreatened. And as we've talked about, that operating environment has dramatically changed. So those school bus sized satellites that cost billions of dollars and took 10 years to build, we now need to shift that model to building dozens, hundreds, thousands of satellites on much more rapid timelines. We need to have the responsive launch capabilities to be able to get those up on orbit much more quickly. We need to be able to better leverage what the commercial sector is doing in space and better integrate with our allies and partners. You really, I think, affect China's decision calculus when they're not just up against the United States, but they see this united front of an integrated architecture with the United States plus our allies and partners in space.
I think that one of the things that Carrie noted about leveraging commercial, perhaps one of the most important things we need to do is to get out of our own way. The next generation of SpaceX launch vehicles is Starship. This is going to be a heavy lift vehicle, the kind of thing that would support operations to the moon, potentially to Mars. The latest move by this administration is to give the Fish and Wildlife Service a say in whether or not Starship is going to even have a second test. Now, with all due respect to the Fish and Wildlife Service, I'm not sure their expertise in terms of space launch capability assessment. And by the way, this has never been done before. There was no, to give an example, Neil Armstrong and company did not have to put an application in with the Fish and Wildlife Service before going to the moon. But if you're going to insist on that sort of thing, guess what? You're going to hobble one of the engines of innovation, one of the engines of technology. A second area, more at the tactical level, is cyber, simply because it permeates everything. And so space has so many points of vulnerability, the quote unquote attack surfaces wide. Your launch facilities, your mission control facilities, the mission data software, the data that it's collecting, all of that is potentially vulnerable. And then finally, again, our adversaries are openly pursuing counter space capabilities. Elections have consequences. We have elected leaders who have chosen, not just at the executive, but legislative branch, to say, yeah, that's okay. We're not going to be pursuing icky technologies like that. It's going to be even ickier, I suspect, if our satellites get blown out of the sky, if our systems are not there for U.S. servicemen and women, whether in the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, or the Black Sea.
I want to stay on this idea about the commercial sector, because Dean, you wrote a GIS report called Space Invaders, The Rise of Commercial Firms, and you laid out 3 different scenarios for commercial actors. So first, that space companies become strategic players and can kind of work with a range of clients. The second, that it gets a little bit fragmented and it's a challenge in terms of establishing operational norms and standards. And then the third was that space companies end up aligning with specific nations. So which of these scenarios do you see as the most likely outcome, and why?
Yes. I think that actually we're going to see a hybrid or a mix of all three. I think the idea that space companies will be strategic players, some of them, I think is inevitable. Someone like Elon Musk and SpaceX has already attracted the unwanted attention of the People's Republic of China, who has held conferences saying, how do we counter SpaceX in the event of a conflict? We know that Starlink was attacked almost immediately by Russian hackers, and interestingly responded faster than DoD could in terms of countering those cyber attacks. I think that we are going to have fragmentation simply because it is an international market. It's not just American companies or even Western companies. We're seeing Israel, we're seeing South Korea, we're seeing other Middle East countries, South America getting into it. And so while big players, Lockheed Martin, United Launch Alliance, are probably not going to say, I think I want to work with China, and China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation certainly isn't going to say, I think our bottom line in working with America is more important. How does India respond? How does a South Korean launch company or a Brazilian satellite manufacturer, how do data services companies that could do analysis on space derived information respond after what we've seen in Ukraine, what could eventually develop, say, in the Middle East? Or, God forbid, if a Taiwan contingency came up, where you are talking about the number one and number two economies in the world going at each other, it's not at all clear how non-American, non-Chinese companies will necessarily respond. Let's keep in mind, French President Macron has made very clear that in his view, a conflict over Taiwan is something that Europe should stay out of. Staying out of meaning essentially not siding with the United States.
What's really interesting now is that with the diffusion of the technology, it's no longer a handful of countries that can build these exquisite billion-dollar school bus-sized satellites. There are over 90 nations now that have varying degrees of space programs, whether within their governments or their commercial sectors. Universities can build a beer fridge-sized satellite or a microwave-sized satellite and launch it maybe for the cost that you'd buy a car off the lot on. So it's become so much more accessible. Countries around the world now have a choice. Do we buy from a U.S. commercial satellite company, communications or remote sensing data, or do we buy from a Chinese company or a European company or something else? I think the U.S., we still want to be that partner of choice, whether it's as a government partner or as a commercial partner. I say the challenge to some of that is that we still have policies in place that lag the technology, that assume that the U.S. is still the top dog when it comes to space technology. And that's no longer the case today. Other countries have a choice. So, do we want to strengthen our industrial base, strengthen our pool of STEM talent in the space sector, or are we going to inhibit that while China and others grow theirs and become more competitive on the international market? So there's an economic piece to this in addition to a national security piece.
I think also in terms of the national security piece, earlier this year there were reports that Starlink either had been shut down or wasn't turned on for a potential Ukrainian counterattack into Russia using their satellites. So my question is sort of whether related to that specific instance or not, ultimately, these commercial actors will have some measure of control as other countries are trying to use their satellites, potentially even for military purposes. So How do you think policymakers should think about that? And should those commercial actors have the freedom to sort of turn on and off foreign countries' ability to sort of use their systems for military activities?
Well, I think first off, the listeners and viewers of this podcast should actually go and do some research regarding what specifically occurred in the case of SpaceX, Starlink, and Ukraine. Without getting into the details of that, I think what is very important to recognize is that DoD has stated that it has no obligation, the U.S. Space Force is not obligated to protect private commercial satellites. And in this regard, it's a lot like Cyber Command is not necessarily going to defend corporate IT structures. This is completely new because of these environments, because of how they operate and where they operate. In the past, if you attacked a U.S. ship at sea, that was an act of war. Here, it's become much more complex. So this is going to sound a little bit like a cop-out, but probably the most important thing that we need to do is to, one, have a debate on this, and two, actually think hard about what do we want the government to do? What do we want to allow companies to do? And if the answer is companies can't defend themselves, but the US government won't either, you're creating a very, very ugly structure. And one of the potential unintended consequences of that is, okay, what happens when you're not allowed to defend yourself and the government won't? You hire someone who is legally allowed to protect you. Now, I'm not sure anyone's really thought that far down the road, but people are not going to invest trillions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure and then say, and I hope nothing happens to it. Whether it's bad commercial players, bad criminal players, or bad national players. So if we don't come up with an answer will emerge, and that answer may not be what we wanted.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting open policy question here that Dean's highlighting. I mean, what is the role of the U.S. government in protecting non-government space assets? If you look at other domains, the maritime domain actually, the Navy has sent forward forces into the Gulf to be able to protect commercial shipping vessels that are in duress from Iranian fast boats attacked. Now, it's not a blanket, we're going to protect everything. I mean, you need a much larger force structure to be able to do that, but there are certain circumstances where it does make sense and it is in the national interest to do that. So I think that we need to better unpack that policy issue and examine it. And I think that there are lessons in international maritime law and in the maritime and in the cyber domain that possibly space can learn from. But I think it also ties into needs to be this tighter partnership between the public sector and the private sector, and a tight relationship. I think not knowing the specifics of that Starlink incident you mentioned, just having that trusted line of communication open between the government and those commercial operators, I think will go a long way in terms of understanding what do we need, what are the threats to your operations, and where might the government be able to help, but also can the government share information that allows that commercial operator to take their own protective or defensive measures.
One of the things that we've spoken about here has been the need to cooperate with certain partners. It seems to be something that China is doing more of as well in terms of cooperating. You mentioned Venezuela. The Chinese have taken a keen interest in expanding their space program in Latin America and the Caribbean. Also in Argentina, they have their space satellite tracking station. So, and with respect to Russia as well, they've been increasing their space cooperation. How do these relationships between China and other nations affect American national security?
Space in this regard is only one tool in the toolbox. For the Chinese, that's how they view space. Space is important in its own right. It supports information, but it's also a diplomatic tool. It's a trade tool. It's a technology tool. China exports satellites. It really set the stage for turnkey operations. They would design a satellite, build a satellite, train the ground crew, build a ground station, launch the satellite, all for one low, low price. As a result, the country that buys that satellite becomes accustomed to operating Chinese systems. And so if they become better off financially, evolve further along technologically, guess who they're going to pick for the next generation of satellites? It's sort of like Toyota. When you're young, you buy a Scion. As you get a little older, you buy a Toyota. And if things go well, you wind up buying a Lexus. Why those three? Because they're all Toyota products and everything works the same way inside. So the Chinese have been very good at that long-term planning of using space, or in other cases, 5G communications, or in other cases, port management skills, whatever, to get the foot in the door, to build that relationship. So in the long term, there's a trade relationship, there's a political relationship, and in an ideal world from the Chinese perspective, a dependency relationship.
Well, in telecommunications, there's actually a great example, not great examples, but with what China's doing with their Belt and Road Initiative, the African Union, as their state-owned enterprises acquired and operated the African Union telecommunications networking system. It was reported that for 5 years, data was being siphoned off of that network and sent back to Beijing every night. Tanzania is another example where China came in, put a nice bow on a great package deal to build out their telecommunications infrastructure. And Tanzania, as a result, they've started adopting more Beijing-like data laws, cyber laws, more restrictive on their social media, access to the networks, et cetera. So there are larger consequences of going down that China path.
One of the things that influences our abilities to counter China is obviously the budgets that we have, focused on space initiatives. President Biden signed off on a $33.3 billion space budget for fiscal year 2024. That's about a 15% increase over fiscal year 23. How do you view those funds? I mean, are those funds necessary? Are those funds sufficient? What would be the sort of best use of that increased investment? We'll start with Carrie.
I wish I had data on, what did the Air Force look like after those first couple of years after 1947? It takes a while to build a capability. I think they will continue to have to grow. Right now, just the number of Guardians, I think it's the request in the budget this year was 9,400 active duty Guardians. That's 20 times less than the next service, the Marine Corps. And yet we are asking them to make this radical change to their space architecture, from buying these few exquisite systems to these proliferated architectures in the hundreds and thousands. We're asking them to do more with commercial. We're asking them to have a global presence, working with the combatant commands, working with our allies and partners. We're asking them to engage more in the international policy arena. We need them to operate differently than they've had to operate in the past with this threatening contested environment that they just haven't had to train and exercise in before. They need greater intelligence knowledge of what our adversaries are building and how they intend to threaten us. So there is just so much more on their plate in a domain that traditionally has been a little sleepier, a little slower. So I expect it will have to grow.
In other episodes, we've spoken, at least in part, on international law and its role within U.S. China competition. We'll start with Dean. What is the legal architecture governing space activities right now, and what needs to be added to that to make it more protective of, let's say, American interests?
Well, the legal architecture for space is actually very limited. It's mostly the Outer Space Treaty signed in 1967 and a group of subsequent conventions that support that. The Outer Space Treaty basically says you can't lay claim to a planet or a satellite, so natural body, so you can't plant the flag on the moon and say it's ours. That there's certain responsibilities for the state that launches it, and you cannot place weapons of mass destruction. That's a very important consideration, which is to say anything else is okay. It's just you can't put nuclear or biological or chemical weapons in space. After that, a lot of space law is actually structured around bandwidth and telecommunications. So the International Telecommunications Union, the FCC, have enormous influence over the legal regimes that govern space. The good news, sort of, is that despite 65 years, there actually hasn't been much in the way of space warfare. So we actually don't have a Hague Convention. We actually don't have much in the way of legal issues regarding the operation of space systems in wartime. There is a rule, by the way, that you cannot deliberately harm astronauts. So that's an important consideration there. But again, fortunately, nobody's tried. So we're sort of in terra incognita here. We don't really know what the legal regime's actual impact would be in the event of a space conflict, because it would be the first time that that's happened. Carrie brought up the Air Force. It's sobering to consider that in 1914, people sort of initially waved at each other over the battlefields of France before eventually trying to kill each other. And then rules slowly evolved. Given the speed of technology evolution in space, that will probably be faster. I doubt very many people are going to be waving at each other in space, even figuratively, because it's too important. But right now, legal obligations are still unclear.
And then that translates to the policy space, right? So how do we think about, or what constitutes a hostile act or hostile intent in space? When is the use of force warranted if you are under threat? What triggers an Article 5 response? And we've talked about this in the context of NATO. The US and Japan made a joint declaration that space, Article 5 extends to space. So what does that look like? If it's a cyber attack, how do you attribute it in a relevant timeline for a response? Operationally, if a Chinese satellite and a U.S. satellite are on a collision course, what are the operational practices? Do you call the Chinese? Do you tell them to move out of the way? Are they even going to answer the phone or answer the email? I mean, there's just so much, I think, that still needs to be evolved in the policy and operational space now that we're looking at space as a war fighting domain.
This will be the last question for each of you, and I'll do the same for you both. It's a softball. I like to end with a softball. Although I was told in one of these that my softball question was not a softball. This one really is. If there's one takeaway, I mean, there's a lot of information here. We talked about how this affects the economy, how it affects the day-to-day lives of American citizens and national security and military implications, commercial implications. If there's one thing that you want viewers of this episode to take away as it relates to U.S. China competition in space, what is the sort of key message that you'd like them to leave with? And we'll start with Carrie.
So I would say space is another dimension of the strategic competition that we are in with China. We are seeing it on the military front, on the economic front. Space is another dimension of that. China is clearly intent, not just on matching us in space, but on surpassing us. And so when I think militarily or for our defense, what's the so what? Why does it matter that they would surpass us? And for me, it comes down to an advantage on the battlefield and how space enables our young men and women in uniform to have an edge on the battlefield. If China has that edge in space, if they can see where our forces are, they can target, put metal on target, they can target our bases, see all of our movements. We no longer have the edge.
I think one of the things that we have taken for granted is American exceptionalism. And the most emblematic aspect of that is that we are still the only nation to have landed people on the moon. and brought them back safely. And China has made very clear it's going to do that. One of the things to think about here is, what happens to that image of American exceptionalism? What happens to that global message of, we put a man on the moon, when the Chinese say, yeah, and so have we? What happens if China establishes, even robotically speaking, longer-term missions on Mars before we do? What happens if the only space station in orbit is the Chinese space station? Because the International Space Station is eventually going to have to be deorbited because it is now older than most people's cars. So something to think about here at the more meta level is that space is a place of strategic symbolism and strategic messaging. China understands that. It's one of the key reasons why they are pushing hard is all of the things that Carrie said, military, economic, practical applications, absolutely. But they also understand the nation that dominates space, their flag is going to fly a bit higher. It will get a little more respect around the world, not just in the Indo-Pacific. Right now, that is still the United States. NASA has that reputation. But it can only maintain that. The US can only maintain that if we are prepared to systematically, consistently, persistently push American achievements in space, which, by the way, have strategic benefits, but also to do that communicating of, we rule this roost, which makes us the desirable partner, and which is emblematic of what is so special about the United States compared to the People's Republic of China. Well, let me tell you from here at Armstrong Base, let me tell you from here, the first human transmission from Mars or Martian orbit.
Well, thank you both, Dean and Carrie. We really appreciate this. I'm sure our viewers learned a lot about space. I certainly did, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.